morning, everyone. I, of course, begin by acknowledging and paying respects to, as we say in Fiji, the Vanua, or Wurundjeri, the land and traditional custodians of the Matanitu ko Kulu, and to their matua of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. I also want to acknowledge, well, I was going to acknowledge those workers present, but I'll acknowledge them when they get back from work. Very grateful to be here today and acknowledge all of you for your commitment to this very important issue. An appreciation to Father Khalid, Don, and the Australian Catholic Migrant and Refugee Office. It's an honor to be here today. And I said this at the FCBCO meeting in conference in Fiji last year. Maybe the FCBCO General Secretary will remember. I'm a Methodist, but my wife and my in-laws are Catholic. So whenever I attend things like this, my standing always increases in the extended family situation. So thank you for the credit that I'm getting by being here. But I really am grateful to be here, and I also acknowledge those from DUA, from DFAT, the PLS, Community Connections, and others working very hard to make the PALM scheme work. I would like to really reintroduce myself to you today, and there's a little bit in the program that you have, but to introduce myself to you today as a product of modern slavery. My father's people and my mother's people were from the United Provinces in the northeast of India, brought to Fiji by the British to work in sugarcane plantations under the British system, which was an alternative to slavery, having just been outlawed, called the indenture system. And during the 82-year period of the indenture system, approximately 1 million Indian laborers were shipped to the British colonies of Mauritius, British Guyana, Trinidad, Jamaica, St. Kitts, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Grenada, Natal, Suriname, and Fiji. And the indenture system was a degrading and dehumanizing experience that scarred those who endured its hardships, in particular women, sent at a ratio of 40 women to every 100 men. And they were particularly vulnerable to abuse of all kinds. The word used by the laborers to describe this system of unjust labor, unfair treatment, and terrible living conditions, and constant abuse and lack of dignity was narak, or hell. But in Fiji, the indenture system began when another form of early modern slavery in that colony was ending, the South Sea labor trade. And that happened as slavery was being outlawed in the United States, and slavers from the US decided to ply their trade further south. And while 19th century human trafficking in the Pacific was the legacy of the transatlantic slavery system and a precursor to the indentured labor system, the origins of blackbirding, as it was called, lies in the hands of a gentleman by the name of Benjamin Robert Boyd, who in 1847 employed approximately 65 New Hebrideans as shepherds on his sheep station in New South Wales. Following investigations into their early deaths, Boyd was charged with their forced abduction. The Queensland Pacific labor trade was established by Robert Towns, hence the name Townsville, a Sydney-based merchant and member of the New South Wales Legislative Council, who in 1863 bought 67 Kanaks to work on his 4,000-acre cotton plantation, called, can you guess? Townsville, on the Logan River, which formed the border between New South Wales and Queensland. And you've been having state of origin ever since. But of course, we're south, we don't recognize some of those sports. The plan was simple. Supply cheap plantation labor in tropical Queensland where white men, it was firmly believed, could not work. This plan was soon adopted by those who operated sugarcane plantations. And from its beginnings in 1863 and its conclusion in 1902, some 130 vessels engaged in recruiting South Sea Island labor from 80 islands in what is now Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands. And by the cessation of arrivals in 1904, more than 62,000 islanders was transplanted to Queensland, with approximately 27,000 shipped to Fiji between 1867 and 1879. Many were deported from Australia after, under the White Australia policy. And those who were able to remain were only recognized by the Commonwealth government as a unique minority group, the Australian South Sea Islander community, 30 years ago, on the 25th of August, 1994. Those sent to Fiji still struggle for recognition and land access. What's interesting is that previously, from 1862 to 1863, 32 vessels bearing the Peruvian flag and one whale ship from another Australian island known as Tasmania engaged in what since has become known as the Peruvian slave trade. In an attempt to alleviate the country's chronic labor shortage, they kidnapped or otherwise recruited some 3,300 Polynesians and a further 312 from Kiribati in Micronesia. Now the numbers were small, but so too were the populations of these islands and atolls that the Peruvians devastated, and thus their impact was correspondingly great. In Samoa, 4 years after Western Samoa came under German rule in 1899, the colonial governor shipped Chinese laborers to work on plantations, and that's the Chinese workers working on rubber trees in Samoa. Chinese laborers reportedly complained of tough working punishments, as well as brutal and physical punishments which they had to face, and these reports then prompted the provisional governor of the Canton province to stop sending Chinese laborers into the German colonies. So it's easy to understand why, for those of us for whom this is not just history lesson, but family history, community history, and legacy, view migrant labor schemes, seasonal worker and Pacific labor schemes, etc., with trepidation. Even in this 21st century, history has always found ways to repeat itself. And this is why in 2018, at our 11th General Assembly, the Pacific Conference of Churches signed the Modern Slavery Declaration for Faith Leaders. And that became our entry point into the migrant labor issue. So what does Pacific migrant work look like? Yes, not so much here, but in other states it's rugby, both league and union, or NRL as they call it. Although I think there are one or two big Pacific Islanders that fly in the AFL, as they say. But globally, we have soldiers serving in the British Army. We have people serving in US private military contractors. We have academics, back office workers. These are all skilled migrants. Now, Ambassador Poro spoke about climate-induced migration, and she mentioned the new agreement that was signed, agreement signed at the end of last year between Australia and Tuvalu to take climate refugees or climate migrants into Australia, I think at the rate of 285 a year. And so this is something we have to remember, because climate change will continue to be a driving force for circular and more permanent migration. The Tuvaluan Climate Change Minister, Dr. Maina Talia, has been calling for countries that are major contributors to carbon emissions to recognize their responsibility and be good neighbors to the Pacific. He's often singled out Australia in his call, particularly before he became a minister. And we are reminded from yesterday that the Good Samaritan, the good and loving neighbor, or as they say in Tuvaluan, the tua koe le, went out of his way and out of his pocket to love his neighbor as himself. Climate change impacts lead to displacement and a sense of exile for those affected. From 2019 to last year, in our 5-year work, the PCC reflected on the cry of alienation that is expressed in Psalm 137. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? You see how I'm dressed today. I'm wearing my traditional Sulu because that's what we wear when we go to church. Well, that's what many of us wear most days of the week, but particularly on Sunday. Don't worry, I've got thermals on underneath. But I'm also barefoot because when we enter into homes and holy ground, sacred places both, we take our shoes off. These are some of the things that Pacific Islanders maintain as part of both faith and culture, wherever they go. So this cry of how do we sing the Lord's song in a strange land, as we know from this particular, if we look back at this passage or this psalm, recognize that it's one of alienation caused by colonization, for the forced migration of the people taken into Babylon in exile. And it is a time when faith and culture were deeply ingrained in the people of Israel at that time, very similar to our Pacific people. And this is also the social and cultural experience for some palm workers. Yet, just as climate-induced displacement, relocation, and migration, when it comes to migrant work, we try to shift the narrative from exile to exodus. The understanding reflected by Jeremiah is to work for the flourishing of the land where one finds themselves, to make it one's home. And this understanding is what we seek, or what we understand, because we recognize that as voyaging communities, migration is actually part of our story. As voyaging people in the Pacific crossing the vast liquid blue superhighway on giant canoes 2 millennia before the incarnation. This voyaging heritage can be a source of resilience in the context of climate-induced migration and also the Palm Scheme. Those who receive the migrant communities must be reminded of their Christian responsibility to care for the alien with deep respect, particularly those who are second peoples in this land now called Australia. And that's something significant, particularly for here. And I was very grateful for the passage from Deuteronomy in the reflection and the prayer this morning. Secular and permanent migration must always begin with the do no harm principle. Process is everything. This means as indigenous people who are migrant workers, or that indigenous people, that are the migrant workers that are coming are indigenous people. First Nations people have an important role to play, because as we were reminded last week, during NAIDOC week, that land, language, law, kinship, and ceremony are at the heart of First Nations and indigenous Pacific peoples too. Protocols, the place of spirituality and community, is an important part of this resilience and productivity for palm workers and migrant communities. And I want to acknowledge that much has been done from when the seasonal worker program and the Pacific Labor Scheme were developed, when Palm was launched, and now where we're heading in Palm 2.0 rolls out. There remain some key issues, but as we saw from the Dewar presentation yesterday, these issues are being paid attention to and addressed. But often in the Pacific, from the sending communities, these are the issues that we hear. We hear about the problems and the challenges of the past, because these make the headlines. Research by the Australian National University, which was referred to yesterday, has provided a matrix of well-being indicators for the PALM scheme. So PALM workers feel safe and well when there are strong connections to family and community, when their expectations are met, when there's culturally appropriate services, welfare officers are supportive, they're able particularly to practice culture and spirituality, and all the other ones that you see up on the screen. But in contrast, well, I'll go back because I know you're about to take a photo. In contrast, workers feel unsafe and unwell when services are difficult to access. Transport, knowledge, cost, language, when there is alcohol abuse, and we heard that alcohol abuse is a symptom of something, not the actual issue itself. Dangerous driving, misinformation, challenging work conditions, etc. And I'm grateful to all the parties that work in collaboration to create this community of care for workers. And the Pacific Conference of Churches is on the PALM advisory group and also engages with community connections and governments to provide that ecumenical safety net, not only in Australia, but back home as well. And this must be said, this is not only Australian government responsibility or communities' responsibility, it's also a responsibility of communities and governments in the sending countries as well. This is a joint responsibility to care for our people. For the last few years, whenever there is an opportunity, PCC connects our Pacific church leaders, presidents, general secretaries, elders with PALM workers. So if we have a meeting in Australia and there is an opportunity for them to extend their stay, we work with one of the Community Connections group. In this case, we were working with PICSA, the Pacific Islands Council for South Australia, to connect them with the PALM workers. The New South Wales and Australian Capital Territory Synod of the Uniting Church in Australia has just appointed a senior Pacific Island minister and theologian from the United Church in the Solomon Islands with a wide regional expertise and experience to manage their engagement with PALM workers and the program that they intend to develop. So here we have church leaders in, I think in Renmark, somewhere that side, meeting with community workers or PALM workers from Fiji, Kiribati, Tonga, Samoa, etc. And I had the opportunity to go up to Border Town in South Australia and meet workers working in an abattoir there and spend some time. And what's interesting is you will see in the picture on the far right, and the one at the top, they're in rescue uniform. They volunteer after hours as a way of giving back to the community, and that helps build their relationship with the community, particularly for the longer term workers who are here for 3 to 4 years. So I'm going to share some findings from our own PCC engagement by church leaders and PALM workers, and this took place in 2022 and 2023. So a lot of issues around orientation and recognizing the need to really, for the people to really understand what this experience is going to be like before they leave home. What weather they'll be working in, the changing weather, the different conditions of work, etc., the different conditions in different sectors of work. So these were some of the issues that were shared and some of the recommendations that were given by the workers themselves. It's part of this talanoa, this dialogue that our church leaders had with them. And of course this will be uploaded on the Padlet so you can have a look. So there were some important recommendations about sending countries and the role that sending countries and communities need to play. And then, of course, orientation, again, that takes place in the land now called Australia when they arrive. And the clarity that people seek. So these continue to be recommendations that, that the work has shared. Lots of recommendations, which is important because it shows that the reflections of workers can help inform the scheme. There are issues around health insurance, questions around health insurance. And again, these are not issues that happen everywhere. In many places there are good employers, etc. But these also reflect some gaps and help us identify how we can strengthen the safety net that we are called to provide. Challenge of accommodation. Accommodation tended to be a very big issue very early on in the scheme, particularly from the seasonal worker program and the Pacific Labor scheme, the earlier versions of that. And these have continued to be addressed, but recognizing that people need space and also recognizing cultural differences. Some people culturally, even they're from the same country, because of the provincial issues, cannot share space together, cannot work together. And these things also need to be taken into account. There were concerns around wages, salary, tax, understanding what the deductions are, understanding the forms that they are given, who explains this to them, etc. And again, a series of recommendations on that. And then we know that the family accompaniment visa is being trialed at the moment, but there were some concerns about family and community. And of course, some of this has been mentioned already from the panel yesterday. But the recognition of being away from home. I'm a migrant worker because I spend 9 months of the year away from my family. So I'm going home tonight, I get there tomorrow, and because of my work on Sunday morning, I leave for the Marshall Islands to meet with churches and attend another meeting. I have lived in another country to study while my wife raises the children at home for 2 years. I have been fortunate to be able to go home in semester breaks and things like that. Many aren't. So just understanding that there is a level of trauma and stress. And in our Pacific culture, we have this, well, in Fijian, the Itoke language, we call it the Vosota. It means to bear it. And when anybody asks, are you okay? We just say, yes, we're okay. But that's something we all do. But recommendations about how we could engage in some of these things. And this has been shared with DFAT following the visit by our church leaders. And of course, our responsibility back home to provide pastoral care for communities who are, and families who are left behind. It's also important that as there are safe hubs, etc., care, the issue of gender-based violence, etc., is addressed here. We need to be managing that also back home. And of course, the issue of Sunday worship. Now, we explain to them that, particularly for seasonal workers, if you don't pick, if it's harvest time, you've got to work. So how do we as churches then adapt to those situations? For example, should there be an early morning mass or late evening mass when they get back? That sort of thing is something that's quite significant. And the issue of sexual reproductive health information, rights, etc. Because these are also things that in the Pacific we don't necessarily talk about because of cultural issues. But there needs to be some awareness for these communities, for these workers. Last year we held a consultation for Pacific churches from sending countries, communities and church representatives from receiving countries. We had DFAT, the ILO, International Labour Organization, International Organization on Migration, Pacific Islands Forum, civil society, and the representative for the lead from the Fijian Labour Sending Unit, the National Employment Center. The meeting was opened by the Minister for Productivity, Employment, etc., who is himself a former trade unionist. And the week-long gathering reflected on churches and civil society's duty of care for both palm workers and their families. So looking at not only what takes place here, but what happens back home as well. And this framework is something that we started to engage with. What does it mean when we train, prepare? What's the pastoral engagement? What are the support mechanisms? And in particularly for us in sending countries, what does reintegration look like? So again, reflecting on what was shared earlier, and some of the things that we had learned. So there were some very good recommendations on pre-departure, on arrival, the importance of financial literacy programs, etc., to prepare people before they come. That there needs to be intentional recruitment, pastoral counseling for married workers. What does, understanding managing long distance relationships, etc. Understanding and the process of screening workers before they come and how they will cope. And as the number of workers grow, what sort of advice can returning workers, families, and government representatives provide back home? And not only in the preparation of new workers, but for people who are actually considering to apply or to come. So even when they register, there's a lot of time for people to go through and learn what that means. What is our role as sending countries? What sort of pastoral support are we there to provide? What sort of information? What is the role of the community? Because these are not individuals, they're members of community. Again, managing expectations, including families to be part of training. I've been very fortunate that I've been able to engage with palm workers, some palm workers, while they're doing their pre-departure training. And they come back after this really short, intense teaching time, and we sit down for the whole evening and we unpack what they've learned. And then a number of questions that come up that they don't feel confident in asking. Because when we said, is everything okay? Their response in Fijian is Iosaka, yes sir. It's our culture to not question authority. And of course, this important work around the role of the community connections, which we're very grateful for what they do. So we continue to look at what sort of support can be provided in country and in sending countries. And the issue of reintegration is quite significant as well. That alienation can actually continue depending on how long they've been here and how quickly they've had to adapt and adopt the Australian way of life to when they go back home. And that's a challenge because often we're told when we discuss this issue, well, look, they're in Australia, they've got to live like Australians. But they're not Australians because they will go back home. And in the back of their mind, those are some of the challenges that they're dealing with. So, thank you very much for your attention. I know I've spoken for far longer than I was expecting to, but I hope there's an opportunity to take some questions. And ultimately, the Pacific Conference of Churches and member churches are committed to supporting our people as they engage in this process. Naka, thank you.
Thank you, James, for the presentation, and there's a lot of valuable material in what you presented for us to engage with. And of course we are already in some ways engaging with those things. We call this a partnership program between the 10 partner countries and Australia. To what degree is the Pacific Conference of Churches involved in the conversation about the shape of the PALM scheme from the Pacific point of view, noting that all Pacific Island countries identify strongly with their church communities?
Thank you. From the Pacific Conference of Churches methodology or way of working has 3 Ps: the prophetic, the pastoral, and the practical. Of course, in the prophetic or the advocacy area, and in the context of self-determination, we recognize that this scheme, while it benefits Pacific Islanders through remittances, benefits Australia a lot more because of what it provides to the Australian economy in terms of the industries, but also what it means in terms of putting food in the supermarkets. You know, we heard the story of dealing with the broccoli in this weather. And I visited citrus farmers in Renmark and people working in abattoirs in border towns. So when you go to the supermarket to do your next round of shopping, just really pay attention to how much of that comes through the PALM scheme. So it's not that, and you know, with the whole geopolitical stuff that's going on, and I don't want to get into that because that's another whole conference. It is important that Australia sees itself and shows itself to be a member of the Pacific family and a supporter of the Pacific. And so this is actually not just an economic thing or trade, it's also part of foreign policy. So equity is very important in this, and how we honor that. And the recognition that not only is this scheme providing opportunities for employment to Pacific Islanders, but Australia is also benefiting. Now there's some major challenges. Samoa suspended the scheme themselves for a while because of labor shortage. And there's an issue because this was originally designed for unskilled labor. But in Fiji, under the previous regime, the retirement age for civil servants was 55. So you actually have senior civil servants coming to pick fruit because they're unemployed. And there still is a lot of unemployment in Fiji. But at the same time, you have some communities in Samoa, elsewhere, some villages, where the youth are no longer there. So our elders are forced to do work that usually the young people, fit, virile people would be doing. Now, if you take that in the context of everyday life, that's one thing. If you take that in the context of cyclones, when a community is affected, it's usually the strong, able-bodied ones that support. That's missing in some spaces. So the management of this is very important, and here the role of sending countries. So our advocacy, and please don't take me wrong, I don't only do advocacy to the Australian government, we also are speaking to our own governments about how this is managed. Because when you have countries that are in debt, particularly because of climate adaptation, etc., and development, the need for these remittances are very important to pump cash back into the economy. So it's trying to balance that kind of challenge. So we are trying to particularly work with our national councils of churches across our sending countries, so that they can, because they're a national body, engage with the labor sending unit in each country to develop partnerships where these things can be addressed. I will say these recommendations, etc., that we were sharing with you, We've worked very closely with the Office of the Pacific, the Australian Government, DFAT Office of the Pacific. And actually, when the Pound scheme was being reviewed and people were working on researching, etc., they attended the consultations that we held so that they could listen firsthand and they could query and ask questions and not only take these ideas but help us sharpen what we are looking at as well. So yeah, partnership is very, very important, but equitable partnership.
Hi, James. I'm Father Assis, the Vicar for migrants here in Archdiocese of Melbourne. You know, the presentation or giving us the example of a pastoral care for the migrant workers, seasonal workers, is very excellent. I'm just wondering whether in your conferences of churches in the Pacific, do you have Catholic churches members? Or so I think I will also ask Father Khalid, is there any similar organization from the Catholic Church? Because this is a great challenge, or probably Reverend James can share how to implement that pastoral care on the part of the Catholic chaplains. So, Father Khalid, is there any similar organization formed by the Catholic Church in the Pacific?
I say yes. The bishop conferences of the Pacific, Oceania, the 4 bishop conferences, so CPAC, Papua New Guinea and Solomon Island, New Zealand and Australia, and the bishop just approved a new network called Oceania, or Migrants and Refugee Networks for Oceania, and it's the work of the 4 bishop conferences to look after 3 main key areas of concern for our Oceania region. It's the people who are affected by climate change, seasonal workers, sending countries and receiving countries, and also West Papua refugees, as well as other issues related to asylum seekers and refugees in our region. Also, the new network will be the voice for Oceania on international stage, especially like to the Vatican, dicasteries, as well as the ICMC, the International Catholic Migration Commission.
Just to add while you're getting your microphone on, CPAC and the Conference of Bishops for PNG, Solomon Islands, are members of PCC. So we have direct connection to the Catholic Church. So please continue.
Yeah, I'm after do you have, Father Khalid, do you have similar pastoral plan like Reverend James presented? Because I think that would be very helpful for all of us here. Particularly in my case in Melbourne, we're interested to have similar plan, or if Reverend James can share, we can also adopt that. But if there is for the part of the bishop conferences, we are happy to have that. Thank you.
It's our plan. So it belongs to everybody.
Just, I'm Annette, and I'm the, we have ACRAF here, which is Australian Catholic Religious Against Trafficking. There is a global network called Talitha Cum that is based in Rome, and it has regions, and we have a region of Oceania, and I'm the regional coordinator. And up until September last year, it was only Australia and New Zealand. It now includes the Pacific Islands. So it's an emerging network who will be Australia and New Zealand, where we've got the seasonal, we've got a brilliant opportunity to really network, and one of the ACRAF workers is here from Kiribati. So we will be really networking really closely on the seasonal worker program. So Sister Esther Powell in Fiji, I presume you know Esther. Esther is the regional coordinator for Talitha Kum Pacifica. So wonderful opportunity to network.
Thank you. Yes, we just had the discussion earlier, just before the session. But I think the word, that word network is very important. There are often times when our different denominations go off and do their own thing. But this is very important that before we do that, we sit together and we discuss who does what, and we share the load, and have a united way of engaging. Thank you. Sorry.
Father Frank, a member of Missionaries of St. Charles, as Calabrians, whose mission is really for migrants, refugees, and seafarers. Thank you very much for your presentation, Father James. In the Catholic tradition, we have what's called principle of subsidiarity. So which means that we, the religious organizations, we help the government, who is supposed to be the main principle of protecting the workers or migrant workers. So we are proposing, what can be done best, to protect the migrant workers. My question is, how much the governments of the sending countries, the Pacific Islanders in this case, get involved in this, in taking care of or protecting the rights of migrant workers abroad, in this case here in Australia? Or if the sending and receiving countries of governments can network or work together to form a law that can take care of the rights of the migrant workers. Thank you.
Thank you. As was mentioned yesterday, each of the missions or high commissions or embassies of Pacific Island sending countries have, I think, 2 at least. Yeah, around. Country liaison officers.
Yeah, it varies.
Yeah. So they have country liaison officers based with the embassy or high commission of sending countries. And that provides an avenue for workers to talk to somebody from their government, particularly in language, and they can reach out in times of crisis or emergency and other issues. So I think that is there. The challenge, of course, is that from a regional perspective, the agreements between the sending country and the receiving country are bilateral agreements. It's not a multilateral agreement. So each one is separate. There have been calls, particularly from the Pacific Islands Forum through their trade ministers meeting, and next week the Forum Finance and Economic Ministers are meeting in Suva. And since last year, the PALM scheme, or migrant labor, because you have the RSE, the scheme in New Zealand, is now on the agenda for discussion. So hopefully this brings some way of working together. But as I said, I don't want to put all the responsibility on the receiving country here in Australia. Of course, there are rules and regulations here, but our governments have to step up in the Pacific as well. I mean, we still have some places where workers' rights are not very well protected in sending countries. So how will they fight for workers' rights in another country? So that's our prophetic task on both sides.
Good morning, Sophia from the Office of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner in New South Wales. Thanks so much for this very enlightening presentation. I have 2 quick questions, if you'll indulge me, which links actually to exactly what you were mentioning just a moment ago. My first question is, the New Zealand Prime Minister a couple of weeks ago on his visit to Papua New Guinea, said that he hoped that the RSE would double in size in the coming few years to, I think, 38,000. And many recognise that if there were reforms to the Working Holidaymaker program in Australia, that could also expand interest in the PALM program. And I'm just wondering, from the perspective of countries of origin, for the reasons of sustainability that you mentioned, if some or many of the recommendations that you've made about the reforms to the schemes were taken up, so if the scheme really, was even better regulated than what it is now, are there nonetheless still kind of barriers to possible expansion because of the sustainability issues and the depletion of the workforce, community cohesion, that you think kind of it provides a natural cap? And my second question is, I noticed that one of the recommendations you made was around workers being able, if I understood correctly, workers being able to have more autonomy to move between employers. And this is something that the Australian government has extended as a right to many other categories of workers, to have that freedom and mobility to decide, I want to leave an employer to move to another employer. Is this something that you think, from your conversations with country of origin governments, is also something that is on their policy agenda, or on the contrary, is that not something that is really being pushed from the country of origin side?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second question first, while it's fresh in my mind. I think because these are recommendations coming from workers, they're also becoming, and that has to do with workplace conditions, etc. And as that improves, I think that will also change. But for example, and this was raised, I think, yesterday, when you have couples coming separately, and the challenge of moving, if one has come earlier and is working in, say, New South Wales, I would say here in New South, here in Victoria, and another in New South Wales, how do they come together? And what that role would take place. So those continue to be issues, and I think that as the scheme, as the teams from DFAT and DUO continue to look at how this is developing, this is all being taken into consideration. So that's important. We raise the questions, and sometimes we are articulating what is already in people's minds. The issue, what was the first question? Oh, yes, sustainability. So there's a lot of conversation about, in terms of caps, that the countries of origin need to be working to set those caps. As I mentioned, Samoa was the Prime Minister of Samoa, she's been very adamant about the need to maintain a labour force, because then what happens is, as Pacific Island countries' workforce is depleted, we now create a secondary migration situation, where migrant workers, particularly from Bangladesh, etc., and other parts of Asia, more populous places, are coming in to replace the workers who have come here. So we now have two sets of migration, and then the need to also make sure that their care and protection is paid attention to. But I think that is why when, for example, with the Prime Minister of New Zealand speaking in Papua New Guinea, that's the largest population. But literacy and numeracy are very important issues. So financial literacy and actual English literacy is also, or in their own vernacular language, is very important as well.
Vinaka, Reverend James, thank you very much. I was just interested, Liz Morris from I'm an ACRAF member. I'm just interested, you're speaking about partnerships, and I'm looking at it from an international development perspective. Do you see Australia or New Zealand or other countries incorporating the idea that there are communities that are being depleted of their the able-bodied to respond, say particularly in a disaster response, natural disasters? Do you see that they're incorporating that perspective into their programs? When you have a big international development program and you have a gender lens and a disability lens, there almost needs to be a lens that incorporates the withdrawal of people from community for international programs. Do you see any of that being discussed? You're talking about with DFAT or DURA or others when they're developing their development programs?
Well, not from a development perspective, I think. And I'll be clear, I see this not as a development program. I see this as a trade program because of the areas that it engages in and some of the well-being issues that we face. But all of these issues have been passed on. And so we would think that these are being reflected on by the PALM scheme, the PALM team. But particularly also we need to be reflecting, and we are trying to raise this with our countries of origin. Sounds much better than sending countries. But this needs to be understood by our governments as well. And that perhaps sometimes is a little bit more challenging.
Thanks so much, Reverend, for your presentation. On now, great. Thanks, Reverend, for your presentation this morning. It's Mel Pride from the Pacific Labour Facility. I work in gender equality, disability and social inclusion. I just wanted to know, you mentioned that you're working closely with national councils of churches and supporting them to engage with labour sending units in country and to develop partnerships. It's an area that the Pacific Labour Facility is increasingly focused on and speaking with our partner governments about. And we're aware that there's lots of different organisations and stakeholders in country who do provide that support for workers and their families, but not always working closely together in partnership, and LSUs are not necessarily resourced to be able to provide all of that support that families need. And I just wanted to ask if you could speak a little about your vision about what those partnerships between national councils of churches and labour sending units could look like, and what value that could add to the program and for families.
Sure. So I think the national councils of churches are quite significant, particularly because often of the wide membership that they have of member churches. And we have to recognize that in the Pacific, you know, there may not be a health center, a police station, or a post office, but you can bet there's at least one church in the community, sometimes, of course, more than one. And, you know, we've only really just scratched the surface of this work. Even with all that we've reflected on and heard and are trying to, we're just at the, this is an emerging area of engagement for us. As I mentioned, the Vanuatu Christian Council has already begun to do some engagement. This is a huge area of work, and resourcing this is going to be quite significant. We have some, and this work has been largely supported through the Pacific Church Partnership Program of Defense Office in the Pacific. And we're looking to see how we can strengthen that and what are the resources required for national councils of churches. So obviously the idea would start off by having at least one person being a focal point for engagement. In the consultation we did, we looked at the need for what sort of pastoral training is required for in each community, and who plays that role. Because the last thing we want is to, again, be burdening pastors, priests, etc. with an additional responsibility. But we have huge networks, because within the church you have, starting from children, you have Sunday school teachers, youth leaders, men's and women's fellowships. And if we're able to develop the tools, these can then be given out and developed so that in the, for example, the women's fellowship group make sure that in one of their monthly activities, or during that month, they're actually going out to visit families and have conversations with them so that the women can talk to women and be more open than having the pastor come in, and sometimes culturally that's not appropriate for conversations. The children, the Sunday school teachers can check in on the kids, you know, and that sort of thing. So there are some really good networks which can be used. And this means then we are also just letting our communities look after themselves. So that's very empowering as well, rather than having to manage the systems, because otherwise it's too much. You need 35,000 workers to be looking after the families of the 35,000 that are here or something like that. But I think this is an opportunity for us as we work together to just try and figure out what will work. And I believe that it is in all of our interests to look after both workers and families. And that's why I'm very grateful for the opportunities that we have to collaborate.
Hello, my name is Fiona Ng from the Office of the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner, and thank you very much, Reverend James Bhagwan, for presenting us perspectives from the Pacific people. It's just wonderful to hear. A question that I had, and just an observation as well, is that a lot of the Pacific community, the churches, all the cultural communities, out of their own goodwill, and care for their community, do so much of the voluntary labour and voluntary work to help the Pacific and the palm workers. But since so much of the responsibility is on the employer to ensure that they maintain the contract and pay properly, I just wondered whether there's any possibility for whether it's community connections or the PLF to ensure that employers have the cultural competency and the capability to be employing culturally diverse workforce, because I can't imagine if the power differentials for a worker to openly want to tell their employer if there's any issues that are happening in the workplace because of fear of deportation or just fear of causing trouble. More likely they'd be wanting to speak to someone, a Pacific elder or a religious leader. And I wondered as well, because of the Pacific Labour Facility, they're not given any upfront information about where the workers are going to be, which employers are going to be, where they're going to be placed at. It really makes it hard for the PLF to pre-plan the support that's required in different regions if that's not transparent with them. So I wonder if there's any thoughts about increasing the cultural capability of employers who have most of the power over the workers. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sorry that was so long.
No, but that's a very important question. In Australia, you're told when you are talking to somebody, you look them in the eye and you be straight. In our communities, we look down. Both are showing respect and acknowledgement of authority. Sometimes not recognized. It's a common example of cultural competency. But I know that, and I see the work now on the community connections being quite significant here. And you have not just faith communities involved, the churches involved, but you also have the Pacific Island councils involved. So you have PIXA, you have PIC Queensland and others, New South Wales, etc., that are there. And there is work being done on cultural competency. I know that very well. In the next week or two, there is a Pacifica Philosophies competency workshop taking place. It's a more academic, real decolonized, deep dive into. It's not for the faint of heart, should I say? But I know that there is one representative from Pixar attending, and I know that there's one approved employer attending also to try and get better in understanding this. So, the recruiting agencies, the approved employers, they can, depending on the size. And in some it's not going to be easy because they're not huge operations, but particularly where you are dealing with a lot of people, that cultural competency is key in terms of having someone there that can relate and understand. And look, I think it's just about, everybody being kind to each other. If you come in with that perspective, then it's okay. You can get through the cultural barriers because you're making an effort. And if not, I always say a happy worker is a productive worker. So, even in that sense, it makes good business sense to try and work with your our labor force. Yeah. But certainly I think community connections is an important work area.
Vinaka Valiabu, Reverend Bhagwan. Quite privileged to be sitting here today and also with Akrath to hear what you have to share about Pacific and the life it is for a Pacific Islander. I'm an indigenous Fijian. I've lived here for 24 years. So I'm sitting here today. I actually wear 3 hats. As one of the councillor for Bulavinaka Wellness. I'm actually the founder of it. And I'm from the Migrant Workers Centre, a community organizer. And I'm the wife of Fiji's first country liaison officer, Sairisi Tambolevu. And I just want to thank you for the presentation you did today, because you pointed out the importance of the pastoral care that it's needed for our Pacific Island workers. I find that with a lot of the issues around them comes down to they don't know where to go to, and to them their churches is actually home for them when they're away from home. And in saying the importance of community connections, for community connections it's very important. I was sitting here yesterday and I would just wish our Fiji leader from the Catholic Church, Fiji Catholic Church, would have been here as well, and some of the pastors from our local churches as well, to hear such things such as the wonderful support that the workers are getting from home through Reverend Bhagwan, and also the importance of connecting the community connections to the local churches here, say in Melbourne, connecting with the local churches, because that's like if I travel to Mildura and if I need to look for Fijian workers, where will I go? I go to a church. That's where I'll meet them. And in saying all of that today, is there any way that you will be able to provide any support around the pastoral care and maybe community connections here to ensure that they connect to the local, say for an example, local Fijian churches? There are 4 mother churches I know here in Melbourne for the Fijians. And in the many years since Community Connections has been around, there hasn't been really kind of like a presence, their presence, which is the Palm Scheme's presence around the community, to be there to fully support these workers. So yeah, just want to thank you for your feedback from what you do back at home, and to see if you can have any support around for the Community Connections moving forward. Thank you.
So I think with the work that's ongoing, and I want, again, Community Connections plays an important role. We've got people like Mark and others who are connected to their faith communities, to the churches. We have some of those engagements. As I said, PCC is just in the early stages of engaging on the labor scheme, recognizing the amount of work that is required if we want to support our communities. At the same time, this work requires someone more than just a general secretary of a regional body who has 4 other hats that he has to wear back in the office. And so we are in the process of looking to see how we have one person at least based in in the office to do some of this work, and then to just connect out with the national councils of churches. This is a new issue even for our local churches, so to explain to them, often, and I'll be honest here, often some of the churches are really happy that their members are going out to raise money and to earn money that not only go back to the family but come to their churches also. There was a case of a particular church in New Zealand 5 years ago, where the church leader was arrested because he was managing workers to come in and taking all the money, supposedly for the church, but for himself. So we have to manage that side of things as well. And there is, so we have to, and look, I'll be very honest here, we have to make sure that when the workers are being engaged with by their local churches, it's not just for the soli, it's not just for the fundraising, because sometimes that's the pressure that comes. They're sending money back home to their families, and their families are contributing to the local churches. Then we get some fly-by-nights that come in to do pastoral visits, but actually are doing fundraising at the same time. And I hear this because we get word from the Fiji Council of Social Services where complaints have come through, and they're quite honest and frank with us in our relationship. They said, you know, this guy went on a tour and he was collecting money, and the poor workers had to not only send money home, but now they had to give money to him because he came and visited them and did a sermon, so that they have to give him an envelope to take with him as he goes along. So I've said very clearly to some of our churches that we don't want pastors that fleece the flock visiting. You know, pastoral care should be part of the work that they're doing. And if this means that we have to find ways to support those pastors who are doing that work, then that's what we'll have to do. But we have to make sure that first and foremost, there is a do no harm principle, and the role of the church being a place where people can come and sit and talk and talano and share and joke and laugh. Just going back to one of the earlier questions, the quantifying, there's a need to quantify the amount that the local Pacifica diaspora communities, their service to the palm workers is also something that needs to be taken into account. And I hope that through the community connections that is starting to happen.
Thank you so much, Reverend James.